Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's program of Valley Veterans Forum. I'm happy to welcome back my guest tonight, Donald D. Webster, who is here to talk about two different things in his life. First, we'll be talking about his newest book, Beers, Beer, Trout Tacos, etc. And then after we're done talking about the book, we'll talk about our mutual experiences in Vietnam as part of the 592nd Transportation Company. Don, welcome to our show tonight.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Before we get started, I'd like to run a little clip that we've made about your book so that we can talk about it with a little bit more experience and aplomb.
Great.
Thank you.
All right.
Gather round the campfire. It's time to hear a tale of the giant one that got away. Join award-winning humor writer and columnist Don E. Webster for an engaging, hilarious, and often insightful collection of stories and columns drawn from his 60-plus years of writing about his outdoor adventures. With wit and wisdom, Webster targets the victories and vicissitudes of the sporting life, sparing nothing and no one in the process. Whether you hunt by rifle or bow, prefer dry over wet flies, or couldn't erect a tent if all the scouting badges in the world depended on it, bears, beer, trout, tacos, etc. will whet your appetite for a walk in the wild, a day in the woods, or at the very least, an ice-cold beer.
That was an awful nice little spot that my son put together. I'd like to talk about some of the little stories that have appeared in your book. First, why don't you tell us a little bit about Angus McBean?
Not long after I was married, I got a job working for the California Department of Fish and Game, and I lived at a trout hatchery up in the mountains, raising and planting trout, and it was a fairly remote area. And being already an avid fly fisherman, I spent the winter tying flies in my den. And during that time, I encountered this white-footed deer mouse that came out of one of my drawers, was chewing on my fly tying materials. And I named him Angus McBean, and we had several delightful conversations which we both understood telepathically in some mysterious ancient way. But anyway, that story is basically about Angus, who was murdered by my wife's cat. And I gave him a proper burial in the backyard, and at some point, not long after that, the cat, whose name was Lightning, showed his further contempt for me by peeing on the pillow, my pillow in the master bedroom. And when my wife came back from shopping one day, she missed Lightning, and she asked where he was, and I said, Lightning had a bad experience, he died. And she went into shock and said, why, how? I said, lead poisoning. And at that point in time, she ceased to talk to me for about 3 weeks, and her mother talked her out of divorcing me. And that's kind of the end of that story. But it's all true. I just had to change the names to protect the guilty.
Tell us about your trip to Montana, which formed the title for your book.
Yeah, the title of the book, Bears, Beer, Trout Tacos, etc. When I was a young man, I went with two other young guys, and we took a 30-day trip to Montana fly fishing. And at some point in time, we didn't have enough money when we left home to complete the trip, and we knew that, but we didn't care. It was one of those Mad Magazine type things. Alfred E. Newman, what, me worry? So anyway, we eventually ran out of money, and we ran out of food, and so we had to eat nothing but trout. So we ate trout pancakes, trout spaghetti, Trout Tacos, and we got raided by grizzly bears, and we eventually had to have one of the guy's girlfriends wired him some money in, I think, somewhere in Nevada, and so we drove home. But anyway, that's what that story is all about. It's about that escapade that we had. I think I ended the story with, in those days, you thought you were going to live forever and everything, nothing was going to change, but as I found out, that wasn't true.
Well, no, of course that isn't. Well, we know you love the outdoors. You've written many stories about your outdoor adventures, hunting, fishing, etc. One of your more serious anecdotes has to do with the final grizzly bear, who is the state symbol of the state of California, but no grizzly bears exist here in California. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that story?
Well, it's just a chapter in the book, and it's entitled "Bad News," and it's the story is related as if the grizzly bear was telling it, and it starts out where he explains that he eat just about anything, and you don't know that it's a bear at first, then you finally figure out it's the bear that's telling the story, and it kind of relates the whole history of the grizzly bear in the state of California and how they were basically exterminated and driven out of the state of California and wound up in further areas north of California, like Montana and Alaska and places like that. And ends on a note where the bear says that, it's kind of ironic that you put me on your state flag because I'm not there anymore. And then I finish it up by explaining that the last grizzly bear in California was killed somewhere in the 1920s, not too far from here, somewhere around Tulare.
Tulare, right,
Yeah.
right here
Anyway.
in the valley.
Yeah, it's a kind of semi-humorous story, but it drives home its point about the irony of not only the bear, but what politics and the encroachment of civilization has done to many areas in this country.
Yeah, I also know that you're an avid conservationist from reading your book, and you tell about the effect that Teddy Roosevelt had on the conservation movement in this country. But something I learned from your book was the fact that there had been an assassination attempt on Teddy Roosevelt, something I never knew before.
That's correct. Yeah, when he was running for re-election and campaigning around the country, he was shot in the chest right before he was ready to go on stage and give a speech. And he refused medical attention and went on stage and delivered a 90-minute speech with a bullet in him. And that bullet stayed in him till the day that he died.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it probably shortened his life because he only was 60 years old, as I recall, when
Yes.
he passed away.
Yes.
Well, tell us what buck fever is. I'm not a hunter myself, but you mentioned buck fever, and I've heard the expression before.
Well, it's, if you're a hunter and you've ever hunted big game, some of us at some point, almost all of us as a matter of fact, at some point in our career, we encounter an animal that we're in the process of attempting to harvest, and we get so excited that we do strange things like not being able to pull the trigger, ejecting all the cartridges out of the gun, doing a strange dance and rolling around on the ground. And anyway, it's good for the animal because they escape.
That is good for the animal. Okay, so you mentioned duck hunters and the fact that they're crazy. Maybe it's an inbred for it. And I've heard this before because I've read stories about duck hunting, know that it's usually in miserable weather, in miserable condition, and it's kind of like a form of masochism, I guess. So why don't you give us the details about how that works?
It is a delightful, profound form of masochism, and my wife has maintained for years that that I should be studied by behavioral scientists because of it, because it is a strange phenomenon. But as I mentioned in this book, there is someone who's crazier than duck hunters, and that's mountain climbers, and that's another chapter in the book. They're crazier than duck hunters, and they probably even have more fun than duck hunters in that sense. But
Well, I don't know about that. I tried mountain climbing in school because I had to take it as a PE course when I went to the University of Colorado. And I know one thing, fear of heights is natural to most people. And if you're going to be a climber, you're doing it because you like the adrenaline rush of being not only up high someplace, but being exposed to the possibility of falling and dying. that's probably what weaned me away from the idea of becoming an avid climber. I did it well enough and with ropes at all times, but I had experiences where I almost caused somebody else to get injured, and that caused me to decide that maybe it's not something I want to take up as a sport myself. Lastly, I'd like to talk about something you mentioned earlier, your marathon experience, which also appears in your book, and it's something that we have a shared experience on. But why don't you go into a little bit more detail about your specific motivation for running in this marathon at the age of 71?
Well, the year before I ran the marathon, I was in Hawaii because the marathon I did participate in was the Honolulu Marathon. My son and his wife and his wife's brother, brother and his wife all ran in the marathon that year, and I watched them run the marathon. And so when we went out to dinner that night, I got up at the table and did something that I'm kind of prone to do, is I let my alligator mouth override my canary backside, and I said, I'm going to come back next year and run this marathon. And everybody just kind of laughed and, oh yeah, Don's spouting off again. But anyway, my wife called me aside later in the evening, and she said, you're not really going to do that, are you? And I said, oh yeah. She says, I can tell by the look on your face that you are going to do it. Yeah. And I said, well, she says, you know that an elderly man died today running that marathon. I said, hey, I could get hit by a Mack truck, before I run the marathon. She said, well, that would probably be less painful for everybody, including you. So anyway, long story short, that's how it came about. So I had to hold off. I had to hold off the following year because I developed a hernia and had to have surgery, and that really messed me up. But then I did come back last year, and I did run it with my son, and it was quite memorable.
It is an incredible experience, and it's also one, as you recall, that you probably don't want to repeat. However, I was even more egotistical than you. I decided to run in the second one, assuming that I can improve on my time from the first one, which was a bad mistake. And then I swore off the whole experience. Well, next we're going to be moving on to our experiences in Vietnam together as members of the 592nd Transportation Company. And I put together a little clip here that was, the notes for this clip came from actually your report written under the direction of our Captain Scott, who was our commanding officer there. So we'll look at the clip, and then when we come back, we'll kind of talk about some of the things that happened in between us. The 592nd Transportation Company light truck was activated on 1 June 1966 under TOE 55-17F, dated 10 June 1961 at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. General Order 156, Headquarters 3rd Army, 3rd United States Army, was amended to read effective date 18 May 1966 by amendment to TO 370. The 592nd Transportation Company was one of the units formed at Fort Campbell to come under the command of the 500th Transportation Group Motor Transport, with Colonel H.E. Tisdale commanding. On 1 June 1966, Captain Kenneth G. Scott took command of the company at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. The company's strength at that time totaled 4 commissioned officers, 1 warrant officer, and 18 enlisted personnel. The company established working and billeting facilities under the sponsorship of B Troop, 2nd Squadron, 17th Cavalry, and 101st Airborne. Upon prior notification, B Troop had prepared a portion of the building which they occupied, facilitating the establishment of the new company. As sponsor, B Troop had also requisitioned a large amount of the unit's TOE and T equipment. The newly formed company continued to increase in strength, and on 23 June 1966, there were 113 personnel present within the unit. On this date, the company received letter order number 6-98, a movement directive alerting the unit under sink strike and a port call. Thereafter, much of the unit's time was spent in establishing administrative, operational, supply, and maintenance records and working areas, and obtaining supplies and equipment relative to POM. Unit training had been initiated on 20 June 1966 in preparation for the anticipated overseas movement. At this time, the first task vehicles received a total of 114 MS-4A2 5-ton cargo trucks. Concurrent with its own field training, the company had the mission of supplying elements of the 101st Airborne Division with troop transport while engaged in training exercises. The company also participated in several recon training exercises dealing specifically with guerrilla and counter-guerrilla tactics. Outstanding portions of the training included detailed instruction in booby traps, a Vietnamese village orientation, and night escape and evasion course. Vietnam experienced officers and non-commissioned officers administered this training. On 28 August 1966, 19 additional 5-ton cargo trucks were picked up at the Kaiser Corporation in South Bend, Indiana, and convoyed to Fort Campbell. Again, on 2 September 1966, 22 5-ton cargo trucks were convoyed to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, giving the unit a total of 55 task vehicles. All administrative and task vehicles were then readied for rail shipment and shipped to Mobile, Alabama, where they would sail at a later date on the cargo vessel Thunderhead, destined for Southeast Asia. With unit training completed and these vehicles and equipment which were to be shipped by rail departed, the company submitted its final morning report to headquarters, 3rd United States Army, on 19 September 1966, and on 25 September, the unit departed Fort Campbell by air for Oakland Army Terminal, California. Remaining behind to depart on 2 October 1966 were Second Lieutenant Frederick C. Barr, Chief Warrant Officer Samuel Keck, Sergeant First Class Earl O. Rustin, Sergeant Oliver S. Lee, and Sergeant Thomas O. Ash, who were all members of the Advanced Liaison Party. After arriving at Oakland Army Terminal, the unit boarded the troop ship USMS General William Weigel, and at 1300 hours, 28 September, departed Conus en route to USARPAC. On 14 October 1966, after 13 days at sea, William Weigel stopped at Naha, Okinawa for refueling and pickup of supplies. While the ship was moored, the passengers were allowed shore leave for approximately 6 hours. The ship departed Okinawa at 400 hours the same night, the vessel entering the territorial waters of Vietnam 3,500 hours later, 16 October 1966. Those units scheduled for debarkation left the ship at the port of Vung Tau. At 1100 hours, 18 October 1966, 592nd Transportation Company debarked the USS General William Weigel at Cam Ranh Bay, Vietnam. Debarking with the unit were the 500 Transportation Group, Water Transport, and the 545th Transportation Company. Thus, from a total of 10 units formed at Fort Campbell, only 3 were to remain together in Vietnam. The following 2 weeks found the company establishing its billeting areas, mess hall, and administrative headquarters. The unit's task vehicles were still en route to Vietnam. The company had the mission from time to time of conveying driveaways to their destination, usually the coastal city of Nha Trang. On 7 November, the vessel Thunderhead docked at Cam Ranh Bay, and the company's 55 task vehicles and 65 trailers were taken to the company area Within less than 12 hours, 10 vehicles were operational, performing the mission of port and beach clearance. During the next few days, all the task vehicles were operational, performing port and beach clearance. Trucks were palletized. The unit quickly went to work building wooden decks to place within the bed of the majority of the task vehicles. The truck decks were modified to bring the bed level of the vehicles even with its sides, facilitating the easing in the loading and unloading of palletized cargo. The company's 3rd platoon, led by Lieutenant Barr, departed for Cam Ranh Bay on 9 November 1966 with 15 task vehicles and trailers, destined for Phan Rang, Vietnam, which was located approximately 40 miles south of Cam Ranh Bay. The platoon was carried in a TDY status with length of stay for an indefinite period of time. The primary mission of the platoon was to do port and beach clearance working under the Phan Rang Sub-Area Command. In mid-December, the company's task vehicles were assigned a major responsibility: to transport the majority of cargo being taken off the ammunition pier at Cam Ranh Bay. Utilizing most of its vehicles at the ammunition pier, the unit's daily tonnage figures over a 24-hour period began averaging 800 tons. On December 26th, the unit averaged 1,092 short tons during the 24-hour period. Shortly thereafter, the unit sent 5 task vehicles and 12 enlisted personnel to Phan Thiet, Vietnam, with the mission of port and beach clearance. On the 14th of January 1967, the 3rd platoon returned from Phan Rang, Vietnam, to join the parent unit located at Cam Ranh Bay. 13 members of the 3rd platoon, along with 5 vehicles, departed Cam Ranh Bay on the 4th of January, destined for Phan Thiet, Vietnam, where they were put on TM status for approximately 14 months. On the 6th of February 1967, Sergeant First Class Alfred P. Banish was assigned to the 585th Transportation Company medium truck and was replaced by First Sergeant Marvin Bewley, who was transferred from the 545th Transportation Company light truck. On the 23rd of March 1967, Captain Kenneth G. Scott was assigned to the headquarters 57th Transportation Battalion truck and was replaced by Captain Harry Nelson Jr., who was transferred from the 57th Transportation Battalion. During the month of April 1967, the unit's strength was increased to 179 with the addition of 20 new privates fresh from the States. On the 3rd of May 1967, the unit was given their annual GI for fiscal year 1967. The AGI was given by the 1st Logistical Command. The results of the inspection were excellent. During the month of June 1967, the unit was relieved of the port and beach operations at Pier 5, Ammunition Pier, by the 36th Transportation Battalion. The unit was then given the mission of convoy duty outside the Cam Ranh Bay area. During this mission, the 592nd Transportation Company personnel traveled much of South Vietnam. This narrator can recall convoys to Quy Nhon, Dalat, Ba Me Tu, TDYs to Kon Tum, and Pleiku, among others. On the 1st of July 1967, the unit was notified that another annual general inspection would be conducted for the fiscal year 1968. With a lot of long hours of work, the men of the 592nd Transportation Company light truck accomplished an almost amazing feat. With over half the personnel on convoys to Kong Sun, the remaining personnel prepared for this inspection, demonstrating a very commendable manner. The unit was again commended for the outstanding readiness of the unit. August 1967, the personnel of the unit are awaiting their assignment orders, which are expected to arrive in the next few weeks. With a few weeks left in Vietnam, Men of this unit were anticipating the day their port call would arrive. And when it does, the United States had better watch out, because the 592nd Transportation Company is coming home. The 592nd Transportation Company, by Department of the Army General Order, was awarded the Meritorious Unit Commendation Medal for service in the Republic of Vietnam.
So young and pretty, and one thing I know is true, yeah, you'll be dead before your time is due. Know it. Watch my daddy in bed at time. Watch his hair been a turning gray. Yeah. He's been working and slaving his life away. I know he's been working so hard. You know it too.
Before we go on talking about our personal experiences in Vietnam, Don is asked to read a couple of excerpts from his book. And without further ado, please go ahead, Don.
Okay. This first excerpt is from a column I wrote when I was writing columns for an outdoor web magazine. The excerpt, the title of the column was called Canine Comics, and in 2013 it was awarded the Outdoor Writers Association Humor Award for that year. And this is an excerpt from that column. Dogs, hunting dogs in particular, can be the catalyst of memorable moments, some of which tend to be on the humorous side. My first encounter with such an experience occurred one winter when I was 6 years old. I was spending the weekend with my grandparents, who owned and operated a small dairy out in the country. My grandparents also raised poultry, and there was a large chicken coop next to the barn. During the middle of the night, I awakened to hear a ruckus taking place. I climbed out of bed and went into the kitchen, where my grandmother was pretty excited about something. "Wilbur, there's a fox in the chicken coop," she explained. "Oh, all right," Grandpa grumbled as he pulled on his rubber boots. He grabbed his sawed-off double-barreled shotgun on his way out the door. "I'll take care of the varmint." I followed Grandpa out the door. "Can I come along, Grandpa?" I asked. "Stay behind me, boy," he said. Grandma handed me a lantern. "Take this." We hurried across the barnyard toward the commotion in the chicken coop. Grandpa was leading the way as I carried the lantern behind him, shivering in my pajamas. Grandpa was wearing his red woolen long john underwear. As we arrived at the coop, Grandpa cocked both hammers of his scattergun and flipped the latch on the door of the chicken coop. Something brushed my leg as I stepped forward with the lantern, and I looked down to see Cletus moving past me. Cletus was Grandpa's old Chesapeake Bay Retriever. Grandpa raised the shotgun to his shoulder, his fingers on the gun's double triggers. In the glow of the lantern, I watched as Cletus walked up behind Grandpa, sniffing at something that had captured his interest. Without further ado, he stuck his cold, wet nose firmly through the open trapdoor at the back of Grandpa's long johns. Grandpa let out a startled scream, and the shotgun roared, discharging both barrels. If there was a fox, we never saw it. I'll forever remember my grandpa's animated, colorful excuse to my grandmother about how he came to kill 7 of her prize laying hens. And this second one is a little bit more on the serious side. In fact, it's the last entry in the book. It's actually a poem entitled Coda. The day is coming when I'll return to the rivers, riding the gentle breeze that whispers along a quiet, meandering stream. I'll join the fish holding in the current, finning with them as they dart and feed. I'll mingle there with fat-bellied trout, and in that cherished place, I'll come home. Before too much longer, I'll return to the mountains, riding a cold wind that blows through a steep, craggy canyon. I'll join the deer venturing out at sunset, walking with them through fresh snow. I'll mingle there with heavy-antlered bucks, and in that treasured place, I'll be at peace. In hardly any time at all, I'll return to my beginnings, riding a winter storm that descends from the region farthest north. I'll join the waterfowl landing on the marsh, singing with them as they call in chorus. I'll mingle there with fine feathered ducks, and in that beloved place, I'll abide forever. Thank you
I hope
for
you do.
listening to that.
As I recall, Don, Vietnam was a beautiful country in spite of everything that we saw. And I can remember on many convoys wondering about, for instance, the monuments that we'd pass by, Buddhist monuments. Of course, something you couldn't miss in Vietnam were the smells in the country. And I know you're an avid cook also, and you're one of the few people that I know, besides Bestina, who works here at CMAC, who enjoys Nook Mom. Tell us how you acquired a taste for Nook Mom.
I'd rather not, but anyway, it's a Vietnamese cooking sauce. They had another sauce, by the way, that was actually more well-known in Vietnam at that time. I think it was called bao luc. What it was fermented fish juice. And if you had occasion to get up fairly close and personal with any Vietnamese person after they'd dined on some food that had been cooked in bao luc, you would never forget the experience. I'll guarantee you that. But I still use Vietnamese cooking sauce. You can buy it in these Asian food stores, but it's somewhat similar to a Nuc Mam. In fact, some of it actually is. And then you add a little bit of sugar to it, and with some rice vinegar, and makes a wonderful seasoning for Vietnamese noodle dishes and things like that. Yeah, mm-hmm. I enjoy Vietnamese food. I enjoy the Vietnamese people as far as that goes. I
think we could all say we did. We especially appreciated especially after talking to Dave Olson, who sent those last pictures, the understanding that so many of those poor kids were orphaned by the war. They were without parents, and they were also treated unfavorably by their own kind because of that.
Absolutely.
You know. Well, before we wind up, I'd like you to reminisce a little bit about your personal experience right after we got there when you climbed up to do some exploration at Tiger Lake, which was just above our campground.
Oh yes, Tiger Lake. It's actually a freshwater lake near the Cam Ranh Bay Peninsula. And as luck would have it, our base camp was situated directly beneath Tiger Lake. And we hadn't been there but just a couple, 3 days. In fact, I don't think we had the tents fully erected yet. And I, being an officer, I had a little bit of time on my hands, so I decided I'd take a hike one day. And I did have my .45 automatic pistol on my hip, but I walked up, took an extended hike up to the lake, and I was walking along the shore, and it wasn't a very big lake. It was actually quite beautiful with brush coming right down to the water's edge. And as I was walking along the lake, I noticed something up ahead of me. So when I got up there, I started studying the situation, and it was clear to me at that point in time that I was looking at a set of tiger tracks, hence the name, Tiger Lake. And I could still see the sand crumbling in on a couple of the tracks, and being an outdoorsman, even at that time, I had a lot of experience. I thought, those tracks are fresh. And then I kind of looked to my right, and I saw where the animal had gone up and jumped up into the brush that was right down close to the lake, and I could still see sand falling off the branches from the brush. It was that point in time where the .45 automatic looked like a pop gun to me, like maybe a cap gun, and I turned around, and I probably set the land speed record for traveling the next 400 or 500 yards, getting the heck out of that place.
Traveling down through the sand.
Oh, and as an added side note, I read not too long ago that before we arrived in 1966 at Cam Ranh Bay, some soldiers who had been there earlier, it was a fairly hot zone at that time. Well, anyway, two soldiers had gotten into a drunken revelry one night and walked up to Tiger Lake in the dark, and they were actually killed by a tiger.
I think I read that same story. In talking to Dave Olson, again, who was from a later group that followed us there, and things were getting worse, of course, with the insurgencies and the Viet Cong, members of the 592nd were often sent up there on patrol to search for VC and flush them out. And as you probably have heard, there were subsequent to our time there were mortar attacks on
the
compound.
terrain around the lake there. Good luck with trying to find a VC in there, because I mean you couldn't even begin to crawl through it. It was so dense.
Like much of the country. Well, Don, I'd like to thank you for joining us and sharing your experiences with us. And I'd like to thank all of our viewers for coming back, and please join us again for a future episode here at Valley Veterans Forum on CMAC.
The call to serve. It has no sound, yet I have heard it in the whispered retelling of honorable sacrifices made by those who have served before me. The call to serve has no form, yet I have clearly seen it in the eyes of men and women infinitely more courageous and more driven than most. The call to serve has no weight, yet I have held it in my hands. I will commit to carry it close to my heart until my country is safe and the anguish of those less fortunate has been soothed. The call to serve is at once invisible and always present. And for those who choose to answer the call, for their country, for their fellow man, for themselves, it is the most powerful force on earth.